So I will officially welcome everybody to the seminar for this Friday from the Department of Geology, Geography, and Environmental Studies. I'm Deanna Van Dyke and happy to be promoting these seminars this semester. And I'll just encourage you as you're watching this seminar to mute your microphones at this point in time. If you want to turn off your video while Stuart is speaking, that would be fine. And then we invite you to ask questions after the seminar in the chat or by turning back on your video, and we'll notice that you have a question to ask. I've asked Professor Ralph Sturley to give the introduction for our speaker because of a longer standing professional relationship. And so I'd like to turn things over to Ralph Sturley at this point.
Sure, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to introduce Stuart. Stuart and I have known one another for many years. Just to briefly introduce him, I should let people know that our department as such was broken loose of its prior rooting in the physics department in 1982. So only in 1982 did we actually begin to start offering a full major in geology and in geography. And Stuart was one of the very first majors to come out of that program because he graduated from Calvin in 1984. From there, he went to Colorado State University, where he got a master's in fluvial geomorphology. I'll ask Stuart, was Stanley Shum there at the time?
Yeah, he was my advisor.
Okay, well, that says it. So yep. Colorado State was known and still is known as being one of the focal points in the world where you would want a person would want to study fluvial processes. And Stanley Shum was the guy, the go-to guy. So I think he began that program in water resources there at Colorado State. At any rate.
So by the way, I see Harold Pranger is on with us today, and he studied it there with me as well.
No kidding. Okay.
We both went out west. I think he followed me a year later and studied with Stan as well.
I did not know that. I see Hal's on there, but did not realize that connection. At any rate, so that's just a remarkable thing to have in your background. From there, Stuart actually took a job working in mine remediation, the hydrologic side of mine remediation in Casper, Wyoming. So another interesting part of the world. And then from thence, what came back east was a member for close to 7 years, I think, in an engineering firm that eventually became renamed that people might know around here as Prine and Newhoff. Very, 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 very respected environmental engineering firm in the Grand Rapids area. And from there, he went to the company name that he's already mentioned, V3, which required his main office to be in Chicago. So at that point, Stuart started commuting back and forth between his home address in Kalamazoo and maintaining actually a separate apartment to work out of in Chicago during the week. And he has worked there for the past 24 years and risen through the ranks to be some sort of vice president or whatever they call you, Stuart.
That's right.
At any rate, there have been many, many spin-offs from that work, and that already been alluded to with working in development, hydrologic development in third world or otherwise. I like your phrase, fragile nations, in your abstract, Stuart. And Haiti's been one of the foremost in that group. In 2014, Stuart was recruited to help be part of the planning or steering committee for what became Calvin's Clean Water Initiative. Now, that had been in the works, I think, for a couple of years prior. Tom Timmermans is in the audience today, and Tom was involved at the very earliest stages. You can correct me if I'm wrong about the timing of that, Stuart, but at any rate, it took several years for that to actually work its way through the administrative hurdles at Calvin and become incorporated as a separate institute. Having done so, there have been wonderful projects in various parts of the world, but particularly in Haiti. And some of those projects have involved Renee Sparks, who's here with us today, with students who've gone on to other positions elsewhere. And perhaps someone in the audience today will end up working with the Clean Water Initiative. It could be even this coming summer. But at any rate, Stuart's been a wonderful part of our department off and on then since the 1980s. And we're really glad that he can serve as a mentor to students and a guide person. He's now the co-director of the Clean Water Initiative. And he's going to talk to us about development in water development in fragile nations. Is there something I should have added into that, Stuart? Probably there is.
No, I think that covers it. I'll put a little spin on the Institute as well in my talk, but that's a great summary. Thank you for that.
Okay, good. It's a pleasure.
Okay, well, I'll share my screen here. And can you see, let's see here, I got to move this out of the way, don't I? Can you see the presentation itself? Good, okay. Very good. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today, and I really have this past several months really enjoyed, even in spite of all the COVID stuff, I've really enjoyed being on campus at least once a week and working with Doug Vandergrain, who is my partner at the Institute. He's the director himself, and I am the director of programs. And it's an exciting place to be. We're still small and we're still nimble, and but we're working this year in Jordan, we're working in Honduras, we're working in Ecuador, in Haiti, and we're also doing some stuff. We just found out yesterday that we got a grant this summer to do some geophysics work with Jim Clark at the Institute on campus, actually. Jim will be in California, but he'll be guiding some work by students working on it here on campus in the computer science group. So the Institute's got a lot going on. We're talking to the business school, we're talking to the language department, and we're looking for opportunities to really expand our impact. So let's see. Just a plug for the Institute. As Ralph said, we were founded in 2014 by, I think it was really Tom was the pusher, and he involved a number of people, including myself, and faculty with the vision to impact clean water in this world. We have a three-part mission. So it's teaching. That's a very important part of it. Teaching through doing, really, a lot of times. It's research, and then it's essentially involving students and faculty and outside partners in applied projects that have impact. The important thing to know about the Institute is that it is very multidisciplined, and you'll see this in my talk, is that the problem of clean water is certainly not just a STEM problem. A lot of people think it is, but it is primarily, you know, there's a technical side to providing clean water, but then there's very much to make it sustainable. A business side, it involves world languages and talking to people in their own tongue, and seriously, there's a very important part for philosophy and religion in it as well. You'll see more of that in my talk kind of near the end. So let's talk about water scarcity. It has a number of terms: water scarcity, water stress, water security. And the important thing is they're not all the same. They're not all meaning the same thing. And what we do in an international context is look primarily at the way water scarcity, which is the physical availability of that water, how that interacts with the need for that water. And so there are opportunities through the Institute to look at all kinds of disciplines relative to the science of water, including water scarcity. But what my talk will be about mostly today is these latter two on the screen here, which is water stress and water security. And it's the differing factor there is water stress and security involves the involvement of the human person, so to speak, in the availability of that water for that person's need. And so there's all kinds of ways you can map this. You can look at the physical scarcity of water, but then you can also relate it to how it is available to the populations in the area that the scarcity exists. And what you'll see is, of course, is that there's a very strong poverty component as to whether that water is available for the use or not. What you will see in the wealthier nations is that a lot of times we don't have water stress where we have water scarcity because we're borrowing against the future. Like the Ogallala Aquifer or the aquifer underneath Joliet, which has 780 feet of drawdown from the pre-settlement conditions. And it's because we're essentially drawing from that storage and borrowing against the future. But I'm going to talk primarily today about water stress and water security. There's another term also out there called the International Water Poverty Index. And that's an organization that essentially goes in and looks at different nations and how they, as a nation, experience this water stress. What's important to note is that there's a whole bunch of different factors. It's not just the availability of water, but it's also the access to the water, the cleanliness of that water, and whether it's kind of its environmental context. So if just to look at this graph briefly, the physical availability of that water is shown in blue. And what you can see is that countries like Haiti, which is the lowest on the scale, they actually have a relatively fair access to water itself. It is a tropical island that has a lot of desertification, but it is there is actually quite a bit of water available if people were able to access it. But again, Haiti is the worst in the world actually in terms of water poverty as an index, and it's one of the reasons I work there quite a bit. So there's another way to look at water scarcity, and that is who has access to drinking water. So when we talk about water scarcity itself, it's for irrigation, it's for industrial uses, it's for all, consumer uses, everything. We quite often in the industry will look specifically at who has drinking water, access to drinking water. And the important thing when you start talking about specific things like that is that you also link it to sanitation, because sanitation is really the flip side of the coin. If you have poor sanitation, it's going to contaminate your drinking water as well. And so the solutions often have to really merge both of them. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But as you can see from these maps, it's the poorest nations with an associated water scarcity as well, quite often, that have the least access to clean water. And in a case like this, the dark orange is being less than 50% of the people actually have access to a clean water source. Even though, like in the Congo, there's plenty of water there. That's simply a management problem and a poverty problem. So what's its impact? We all know, of course, all of the diarrheal diseases that public health would be interested in. But there are some really heartbreaking impacts as well. In Haiti, 1 in 8 children don't make it to the age of 5. And 12% of those children that die under the age of 5 years old die from diarrheal disease caused by poor water. We also have cholera outbreaks that happened after the earthquake, and over 10,000 people have died from cholera now in Haiti. And cholera wasn't seen for at least 100 years in Haiti prior to the earthquake, and then that brought essentially on. Globally, we have 1,000 kids a day that die from a lack of clean water, from the diarrheal diseases. I haven't confirmed that number. It seems too horrible to actually truly believe, but that's what the UN says it is right now. In Haiti, the average lifespan is 55 years old, and on the island of La Gonave, it's 45, and that can be directly related to water, because in the DR, which is just across the border on Hispaniola, their average lifespan is 71, and on La Gonave, the largest problem there is that the water is quite salty, and so there's a lot of hypertension problems. In Haiti, the average water use is about 7 liters when they survey that, and we use about 340 a day. So, contributor to life expectancy, again, everything in the orange and reds are well below the standards. And again, life expectancy is a very complex topic, of course, but water is certainly a major contributor. So what do we do as nations for this? The large political bodies, of course, look at programmatic solutions. Up to 2015, they had the Millennium Development Goals. And then since 2015, now to 2030, they have the Sustainable Development Goals. What the difference is essentially they didn't achieve the Millennium Goals. So they re-up again and have new goals for 15 years out from there. But these goals this time are very optimistic, and they're essentially aspirational goals. There's 2.2 billion people that the goals that the developed nations are attempting to give safely managed water. That's a term of art. And but it's also to try to impact nearly 800 million people who don't have even basic access to water. And again, tie that to sanitation. It's to try to improve the open defecation problem that occurs all over the developing nations. They're very optimistic goals. Everyone will admit that, but it's something they're striving for. So who is trying to do this? All of these partners, so to speak, in the international water arena seek out to try to achieve those goals, but they do it in many, many different ways. The key entities, obviously the goal setters are the governments, the multilaterals like the World Bank, United Nations, the regional development banks. And then there's the unilaterals, which are the individual country aid organizations, like USAID is the State Department for us, CETA up in Canada, and so forth. Foundations have a very big role, and they're part of the people we're hoping to talk to more at the Institute in helping us do our work as well. And then, of course, there's tens of thousands of NGOs out there of all kinds of stripes. And I work with all of these. I primarily, in the last 5-10 years, I've been primarily working with the multilaterals and with the US government through USAID. So where do we go for water? I mean, first of all, we need the water molecule. I was working on a project in Saudi Arabia this year, and they don't care how dirty the water is. All we need is the physical water molecule. Now that's different in a developing nation, because to try to convert that to something that's usable, like clean water, can be very expensive. But where do we go for it in developing nations? We go through rainfall runoff catchments. If you can see this photo well enough, you'll see the scum lying on the surface of that water, that's a hospital's water supply right there. It's not a perfect it's not a perfect source, of course. It's very flawed. But when you lack the very molecule itself in some really dry areas, it's what we work with. A lot of people still rely on surface water. People will drink straight out of the stream. They try to make sure it's not muddy when they drink it, but of course that doesn't help at all with the bacteria and everything else that's floating in there. And that's why those heart-rending statistics are so high that I talked about before. Springs are another source. This is the primary source in Haiti. You know, it's something when you can just walk through the forest and all of a sudden water is popping out of the ground. Even though I understand the hydrogeology of that, I still think that's just simply God's gift to the people, that out of the rock comes the water. And it's some of these springs are just beautiful sources of water. They're quite often clean, but they get contaminated right at the interface there with the ground, or they get contaminated because so many people flock to these areas for the water. The other thing about springs, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, is that they are, there's issues you have to deal with. Specifically, there's a religious significance in many of these countries. Springs have a certain sacred quality. And we actually will sometimes, I mean, we've gotten attacked before because we've walked up to a spring in order to sample it and to measure it. And it's because it's seen as a religious area, and you have to treat it with respect. So what I'm primarily going to talk about today is groundwater. And springs are of course the outflow of that groundwater. The nice thing about groundwater is that it's quite often clean if you can develop the well appropriately and if you can go deep enough and get an isolated aquifer. But unless you've got an artesian system, which are very few and far between and very exciting when we run into those things, they're expensive to operate. They take energy to draw the water out, and there's ongoing maintenance. And as you'll see later is that the failure rate on wells is very high unless you approach this as a holistic problem, not just a scientific problem. So how do we do this? This is the fun part, and this is the part that really is the work that I do primarily on an international scale. We do these large-scale hydrogeologic investigations. Sometimes they're fairly small, but many times we're doing 300, 400, 500 square kilometers where we really don't have much geologic information at all. And we really don't understand where the best water resources are. And we have to essentially start from scratch and develop our hydrogeologic models and do the exploration, basically. The fun part about this job in developing countries is that the information quite often isn't very well developed. And so we really are going back like we did 100 years ago and with satellite technology, of course, but we're going back and doing the geology like a lot of the explorers did 100 years ago. So what does it consist of? Obviously, get as much information up front as we can through research. We get as much remote sensing data through aerial photographs, lineation surveys, everything like that we will do before we even get in the field. Then we'll commission quite often a local organization to grab a water source survey, meaning they go out and they'll map all the wells in the region and get basic information on those wells. People's recollection as to when they were drilled, how does the water taste, all of that kind of thing. We'll sometimes supply them with water quality information meters so that they can do that. Otherwise, we'll come back and revisit that with our own. Then we go in the field and we do hydrogeologic mapping, and there's nothing that replaces that, because there's so often where we think we have a target from all of that research, remote sensing, and the water source surveys, And we get in the field and we don't think at all we have opportunities where we thought we had them. We have to go and develop our own. And that's where, you know, many times for these large surveys, we're walking hundreds of kilometers because there's not many roads. And Haiti is a very complex geology. You can be within a kilometer of a really high yielding well or whatever and not hit anything. Many times even less than that, because of faulting, folding, thrust faulting that essentially changes the stratigraphy at the surface, etc. So we do the mapping and we develop our models, and then we go in and we refine that model through geophysics and through test wells. And after we get all of that information, then we analyze when we exploit this aquifer, so to speak, for the benefit of the public, how much can we pump? What is a sustainable yield? It's very important to us that we don't deplete the aquifer, and it's ultimately important to us that we don't impact springs nearby. Because if you impact an existing water source for the sake of a different water source, we've really disrupted things. And so a lot of times our sustainability surveys are so that we don't impact a spring and reduce the yield from a spring itself when we start pumping on that aquifer. So our desk studies involves really digging around all over the world to try to get information. A lot of times foreign countries have been in there. A big source for us is Russian gray literature, which is, you know, it's in Russian, but it's really good geologic mapping. We can find out a lot of information from that in Africa, for instance. One of our most useful sources in Haiti is a book published in 1924 when the U.S. occupied Haiti and did a geological survey of the country. It's a very good book, and it's our kind of our Bible, so to speak, of geology in Haiti. We gather all the maps we can. A key there is you've got to search for all of this stuff in the language that you think it was written. You won't find it on the internet and so forth if you don't. The other thing we do is we'll actually fly to Washington and work in the USGS library for several days, trying to gather as much information as we can from their files. And then we talk to local NGOs and try to get their information of people who have drilled wells in the past. We put all this data together in all kinds of things: topography, meteorological data, soils data, watershed data, well data, and we essentially assemble all of that before we, again, are doing the work in the field. We map it, and this is an example of a one area that I worked that we had 965 records, of which about 156 had locational data, and then we were able to plot that on our study area. And what's important is that we also map the dry holes as much as we map anything else, because that tells us where, you know, that also gives us insight, of course, as to what the geology is. We analyze it for various things. This is how much water we think is yielding from the wells in the area. So we get a water use study. And then that's when we then get into the field and do the real work. And again, it's just good old-fashioned hydrogeologic mapping. The fun part is that it's walking, and we've got our Bruntons and our satellite units that tell us where we are, and we start doing taking points. The key about hydrogeologic mapping is only about 1% of the surface is visible, and so we're really trying to suppose what may be occurring 2 kilometers away from this outcrop that happens to be at the surface in this one location. And with dips and structure interpretations and everything else is how we can basically interpret what's happening some distance away. We then do our own water survey. We characterize the springs, we characterize the streams, we measure them, and we measure the wells and so forth. And then we also really try to identify where the recharge zones are. Springs first. When we're looking at a hydrogeologic study and we're starting to plan our field work, go to where the water is. You know, that tells us a lot right off the bat, is just, why is there a spring here? Why is the stream flowing? All of those kinds of things. Those are our first points of interest. And then we go, the second point of interest, just to say this now, is that then we go looking for where we think the contacts are, because the contacts are where we can start developing our map and start developing our interpretations. But let's talk about springs just briefly here. This spring on the right here is just a gorgeous spring. It's flowing at several thousand gallons per minute, and it's just coming out of the wall. And I don't know if I have a photo of it or not in here, but that's a fault face that we're looking at right now, coming out of limestone. So it's kind of a karst environment where the water is just flowing out of the face of this fault, and it's just wonderful water. It's about that picture is of water that's about 60 years old or so. So we were able to, through isotope measurements and so forth, determine the age of that water and the recharge of it, and so you know, it's nice clean water from really before a lot of the contamination incidents would occur. So springs. Oops, I'm sorry. Let me go back. I'm sorry, guys, just a second. There we go. Is that bar on the top visible to everyone? I was trying to get rid of that. That says pause, share, annotate, all of that, or is that not visible? Okay, good. Then I'll ignore it for myself. So with the with springs, they tell us very much about what's occurring in the subsurface, immediately adjacent and in some region around that spring. We look at the water quality. The temperature will tell us a lot about where that water is coming from. The discharge rate, and the on an annual basis, but also seasonally. And then we try to make an interpretation of the hydrogeologic setting. Now, these are my classifications, but I think there's about 5 different types of springs, and they tell us a lot about how we can potentially develop that water resource some distance away from that spring. I showed the picture is an example of a karst spring. Oh, and the fault face for that is this photo on the left here. So that that's on that left, you see that scarp. That's a large fault that was along the mountain front there, that exposed this limestone that's flowing out. So that's a pure karst. It doesn't tell us a lot about the piezometric surface, because exactly where it comes out isn't exactly where the piezometric surface is. It may be above it. If it's a stratigraphic spring, it will tell us a lot about both the aquifer itself, but also the underlying strata that's maybe holding it up or blocking it. Fault-based, I talked a little bit about that. Topographic is essentially where the piezometric surface intersects the ground surface. That tells us a lot about the piezometric surface, obviously. And then alluvial springs, they don't tell us a lot, but they do potentially give us insight as if we're going to exploit that alluvium as a potential well source. And again, we don't want to impact these springs once we do. We also look at surface water. Some of I gave a lecture earlier this week in the hydro class, and I'm using some of the same figures, so I apologize to the students who have seen this twice. But this is an example of a basin that we had. It gives us a very good idea of the water resources, at least within the basin, because at the upper point there at G88, we had 0 liters per second flowing in the river. When we got down to where it turns into a red line, we had 65.5 liters per second flowing in that stream. We do the stream cross sections just with a McBurney meter, And then, so we essentially had a gaining stream over that length between G88 and P71. And then by the time we got to the bottom there at G88A, the stream was dry again. So it was very clear, and the geology was very clear too as to why this was occurring. Basin A1 in this photo is a volcanic soils. Basin A2 are the limestones. So the volcanic soils were yielding water essentially to the river, and then the limestones were essentially reabsorbing them. After we do all of this mapping, we place all of our geologic observations georectified onto maps, as well as our own hydrologic observations. And we plot that out and start developing our geologic model of the area. So what do? We create cartoons first. You know, these cross sections are kind of cartoons of what we think are going on in a particular area. And there are interpretations of the geologic observations that we've made. And then we make a geologic map. We maybe have a little bit of information early on that can help us date these formations and so forth, but these maps are our own. We developed these. And again, this on the lower one here, that was about 350 square kilometers of area that we mapped. Once we develop this, we start strategizing areas that we want to drill. But to do that, we really need to nail down our hydrogeology. Right now, we have a concept, we have a model, but everything's based on surface observations and maybe some well information, but doubtfully, because we really don't have very good information at all, usually with wells. Our main information is that the well is there, and we can maybe get a water quality out of it. But we really don't know why or how deep it is. We can't figure that out because we can't take those wells apart. So then we go out with geophysics, and Jim Clark is developing some cost-effective geophysics, very much like the kind we use. Our equipment is, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars that we truck around. But it's exciting that the Institute is helping Jim with his development of the inexpensive geophysics, because it makes it much more accessible to do the really good work like this. And then we hike again, and we hike with car batteries. The guy in the middle there has a car battery on his head, and we'll maybe climb 400-meter mountains with car batteries and with 200 pounds of geophysics equipment. Maybe it's even more than that. We use a lot of times resistivity, but we use some seismic, we use some gravity, depending on the area and what we're trying to figure out. From the 2D geophysics information, then we try to make 3D geophysics nets. And that starts telling us a lot more about structure. It also can tell us about water quality. It can tell us also about the saturated thickness of the aquifer. Now, the thing about geophysics is if you don't have that concept, you don't know what you're looking at when you look at geophysics data. Geophysics tells us nothing unless we have already a concept that we're applying it to from a hydrogeologic standpoint. And this is just an example of that, is a resistivity of 100 ohm meters. Can be anything from, you know, igneous rocks all the way to sandstones. What geophysics often tells us is how to refine what our concept is, basically. This is an example of that. So the top is our cartoon, our concept. Then with the geophysics, we were able to develop this cross section below, which is only a little portion. It's only this portion of this mountain face right here. But you can see we can be a lot more precise on our contacts, and we don't have a piezometric surface. Oh yeah, we do, actually. It's on here up high. But you can see in here the wells that we proposed in these areas to test our thoughts. It was only through geophysics and then test drilling that we were able to refine our geologic information. We put it all together. We figure out what the structure is, where it's dipping. We find the faults. Faults are very important because faults can either act as a conduit for water or they can act as a barrier to water. Both are valuable to us if we're drilling that area. If a fault creates a reservoir behind it, that's a great thing, because on a lot of these islands that we work with, we lose a lot of our water to the ocean long before we can exploit it. And so faults sometimes will hold that back, just like the oil industry. Faults can also be the pipe, essentially, for water. And so it provides us both, not at the same time. We have to kind of figure out what we're looking at. But when we put that all together, we recommend the drilling. We refine our maps, put greater accuracy to them. And then we develop our drilling program. This is an example from 15 years ago where you can see where the start of the new road was. And we have to quite often develop our own transportation to the site. This was up on the side of a mountain, and I'll show you here, I think the next slide. No, it's coming up, but we only had a very small window on the side of the mountain in which to drill that we thought we'd get something. And luckily through geophysics and all the other research, we were able to get that right. In this case, we had a very good driller. And here's the slide I was wanting to talk about, is that had we moved our well in one direction or another direction by 1,000 feet, we would have missed it. The piezometric surface is quite high, but you don't hit that water until you hit that limestone, that fractured Eocene limestone that's in the darker blue there. Until you get through that Eocene gray chalky limestone, you don't have any water whatsoever. And so that was at the very limits of our drill rig. That was 150 meters, I think. Yeah, close. And we were able to snag the top of that Eocene fractured limestone and get a well. That well produced about 600 gallons a minute. And this is just the fun. You drill and you airlift and bang, we've got beautiful water. It was fun. That was quite a day when we pegged that one. That was after about 6 months of research and mapping that we finally put the well in. And of course, it's always fun. There was a lot of celebration about this one because this area was really water poor and people really suffered, and it was fun to be part of that community for a little while. So then we test the wells and we start doing that so that we can understand how much can we pull in a sustainable manner. We check the water quality, of course. And then we model. And we model, like in this case, this was down in the southern coast of Haiti. We used ModFlow with the CWAT module in order to map potentially, I think it was, yeah, I've got a slide here. We wanted to map what the saltwater intrusion would be if we pumped from these wells a certain amount over 50 years. And the graph on the right shows essentially our increase in TDS inshore from a fairly high rate of pumping from the wells that we developed along that aquifer. So, and then from that, we developed a lot of our other models, so to speak, hydrogeologic models. The small little picture up here is of our recharge mapping and modeling. This is a water quality model. This is a groundwater exploitation model as to where we thought we could best develop the water supply that we needed. This was a recharge model. So we developed these various methodologies to evaluate the aquifer as a whole. Treatment is always an option and sometimes is necessary. Although we try to discourage it where we can for many reasons, because it's costly and it takes a management, an advanced management to make sure the filters stay clean and operatable. Sawyer filter is one thing that the Institute's working on, testing those filters for Sawyer, and as well as evaluating their effectiveness in Liberia. That's a really cool project that the Institute is working on right now that we're wrapping up this year. So we would call that a point of use filter, the Sawyer filter. And that's essentially saying, look, we can't really provide clean water at the source or through the system because of all of the challenges with the infrastructure, everything else. But at the very least, at the point of use, where you're going to use that water for a potable purpose, then you would use a point of use filter to try to keep things clean. And those Sawyer filters work pretty good. So these are fun projects. They're rewarding projects. They're geologically extremely interesting projects, but there's problems. And this is how this is one thing I do want to talk about in earnestness, because the Institute as well it's not just a STEM problem to find clean water and deliver clean water. It's very much a societal, cultural issue, as well as good business management and all sorts of things. It's a very multidisciplinary approach that we have to take in order to use this infrastructure that we develop and have it be functional after, you know, a good period of time. Within the first year, there's an article out there I encourage people to read. It's called Rethinking Hydrophilanthropy. It's about 8 years old now, and I reread it the other day, and it's aged a little bit in terms of its some of the things that I think are right or wrong in the article, but it's a very good article that describes the problems that are outside the technical problems. In Africa, for instance, it talks about 800,000 hand pumps that have failed, that are essentially non-functional. That's billions of dollars of investment that no longer has any value. And we see this all the time, that you go from place to place, and sometimes we think this is really going to be a great place to put a well, and sure enough, there's an old abandoned well there that's been broken down and has rocks in it, you know. And so again, that's a failure. That's a failure of the organizations that put those wells in to really do the work adequately to make sure that there was a system, a societal system behind it that can support it. The big thing also is we have to involve governments. A lot of times NGOs and so forth come in, just do the work, get out, and don't do the necessary hard work of working with the local people. So what does this look like? This graph, top graph is percentage of systems functional. This was in 2005, but so if in the year 2000, only 70% of the wells that were functional in 2000 were functional in 2005. In 2005, when the data was actually collected, only 80%. So 20% of them failed within the first year. And then you can see that go way down to 10% when the wells start becoming, you know, 10, 20 years old. And it's not because the wells are plugging up or anything, it's because the mechanism is broken. And sometimes that mechanism is $1. It's $1, but it's because you haven't developed, again, a support system for that well in order to engage the local people to essentially take ownership of it. The picture on the right is a heartbreaking one for me. It's a well that was we probably spent $200,000 on that well ultimately in the end. And you know that pump sitting on the ground there is probably a, you know, I bet that's a 100-horse pump, and that was probably $12,000. And look at what that well house looks like. I mean, again, it's because in this situation, we didn't work well enough with the local government. This is only 5 years old. This is what happens to a $250,000 well program after 5 years if you don't do the job right. I have a friend who says he's got a PhD in failure, and I know what he means by that, because I mean, so much of your stuff that you do, if you don't do it right, ends up looking like this. This is an example of, I'll just say it briefly, the green and the blue are areas where countries that are going to be able to achieve the 2030 goals. And if you're in the yellow or in the orange, you're not on a track to achieve 2030 goals. And you can see that most of the countries that are profiled here, the poorer countries, aren't on track to achieve those 2030 goals. So what do we need to do about it? What's so exciting about being part of the Institute now in a very functional way is that the problem really is all of these other things outside of the technical problems. And that Kelvin College has this great opportunity to contribute in all these different multifaceted ways to solving this problem, much more than just the science of it or the engineering of it. So what can happen? What can go wrong with aid? First and foremost, when you provide aid to a population in a programmatic way, it breaks down in a lot of different ways. And what I mean by programmatic, there are charities that we do person to person. We have our personal charities, we have our friends we help, we have our acquaintances maybe. When you do that, that's person to person, and there's all kinds of ways that relationship helps the environment of giving. But when you try to do it programmatically, meaning you go to a population as an outsider and you try to help them, all of that aid will in some manner, large or small, have a damaging impact on that population. It has hopefully a much greater positive impact, but there's always going to be a damaging impact. And the way then we don't have a do nothing option here. We're instructed by God to help people in need, but you have to do it smart and with discernment. And again, that's why it's so important, so exciting to be part of Kelvin. But what can go wrong? First of all, when you give something to someone and it's an impersonal type of action, there's a condescending nature to it. It builds indignity in the people. It builds dependency. It builds resentment. We feel that all the time when we work down in Haiti with communities. They resent us many, many times. And they resent us because so many organizations come in and just as almost not a bully, but they come in and they say, this is the way it's going to happen. And just stand back and let us do it and let us help you because you can't do it yourself. That's essentially the message that gets communicated. So you have to be aware of that and you have to counter it now that is there in the community. Aid undermines governments. You can't undermine a government because you're not going to be there forever and be part of that solution. The governments have to be part of it, at least on a wider societal basis. They disrupt local economic conditions and supply chains. You know, there's the classic example of food aid coming in and putting the farmers out of business. There's the supply chains where well supplies come in free into the country and it bankrupts the suppliers of well parts in the country. So there's that disruption of supply chains and the economic conditions. There's the other thing about aid brokers. There's people that get in the middle of the aid that you're providing the community, and sometimes that's good. You need people to be, community representatives and so forth. Sometimes though, if you're not careful, those people start leveraging the aid that you're bringing into that country for their own power and their own enrichment. There's corruption that it encourages. And we see it so many times. There's a distortion of religious organizations. Churches become capitalized, so to speak. I mean, they become essentially conveyors of aid. And again, that's a good thing to have happen, but it's got to happen correctly. Because if you don't take that into account, that that's a possibility, then it will happen, and then you've essentially made situation worse. Maybe people have clean water, but now they've got a bigger problem. Their churches are no longer really serving them. And there's so much more. So what are the best practices? And this is my last slide. So I will spend a few minutes here. Again, there's different kinds of aid. There's the charity aid, where there's a personal thing happening there. A lot of missionaries are that way. Those are all good things. But then there's development aid, where these big organizations, countries come in and they essentially want to help accomplish something. And so you've got to know what kind of aid you're working for. Both are legitimate, but both have their potential downsides as well. There's also emergency relief aid, which is an entirely different thing again, where you break a lot of rules when you're doing emergency relief, but you do it because the time is of the essence. And so you just got to get that help in there quick. And you do avoid many times a lot of these other aid broker problems and these condescension and all that, because there's a true emergency that needs relief. And again, so I'm really not talking about relief aid at this point. I'm really more talking about charity and development aid. Best practices would include just having respect for the people you work with, showing them that respect, also for their autonomy, for their ability to make decisions, and essentially that you're a guest in their country. Language, this is my biggest, honestly, this is my heartbreak. Language, I'm never good at learning languages, and I am so sorry I did not spend more time becoming conversant in a language when I was at Kelvin. A language, if you're going to talk to people, if you're going to compel them to action, if you're going to work with them on a daily basis, you really need to work with them in their language. It's very, very important. And I really would love to see at Kelvin, I would love to see the STEM sciences and the language department really come together and develop a program for those who want to work internationally, but to really have that emphasis on language. French is a very important language internationally. Most aid organizations outside of the US would rather work in French than in English. So when we go to meetings, it's always in French. That's not just because of Haiti. That's because Switzerland and all of these countries that are big in aid like working in that language. Got to engage the government. You got to engage the local population. You've got to give them some skin in the game. That's partly a respect thing. I mean, it's self-respect in a way, but it's also when they have an investment, when they have ownership in some infrastructure, they take care of it and they start treating it as their own. If it's just something gifted, it turns out like that well site that I showed you a picture of with motorcycle parts in it. A huge thing, and this is another exciting thing with the Institute, we're talking to the business school, is you've got to have a sustainable financial model for the maintenance of these, whatever infrastructure, water infrastructure you're putting in. And that means you have to sell the water, and there has to be a local business capability for that water to support the cost of running it. And that's just good business practices of all kinds of things, including teaching customer service, because you've got to teach these operators that their number one goal is to provide a quality product, which is clean water. Try to use local supply chains where you can. Don't bankrupt local businesses because you're coming in with some subsidized materials. You got to use good engineering that's contextualized. I worked on a project in northern Haiti where they had 21 sewer pumps on a little, I don't know, 50-acre property. And it was a little bit hilly and so forth. And this large engineering company came in and designed 21 pumps. And it was, you know, it was just ridiculous for a context like Haiti. So you gotta design to the country you're working in. You gotta evaluate the sustainability of the resource, which is what we do. But you've got to help them then make sure we don't exceed those sustainable pumping rates. And culturally, the work you do has to be contextual culturally as well. Again, the springs, and don't think that the way you like to do something is the way the country that you're working in likes to do things. So if you're working around a spring, you have to work with the locals to figure out how best to protect that spring or develop it into a water supply that's clean. And then finally, of course, water has to always be linked with sanitation. Open defecation is such a big problem in these countries, and you have to bring a sanitation program in with the water as well, because you really need to protect the resource from these widespread sanitation problems. So that's the end of my talk. I am open for questions.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That's great. And you're going to see a little bit of clapping on the screen. Assume that behind a lot of other names, people are clapping and tooting and hollering and all the rest of that. For questions, people can ask questions directly. And I think it looks like Professor Sterling has a question already. Oh, maybe I'm seeing the clapping hand on his slide there. So you can ask the questions directly, or you can put a question into the chat and I'll be monitoring that. I am seeing a hand up from Jason Van Horn.
Oh, hi, Jason.
And I think you might be muted or your sound might be low.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Sounds great.
Okay, great. Wow. Thank you, Lord. Immediate technical solution solved. My question, Stu, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm curious, what role do you think the Institute for Clean Water Institute at Calvin University can play in fostering collaborative work with other universities, such as at the University of Haiti or other places? What role do you think the Institute can play to foster those kinds of relationships that maybe would provide, I don't know, cooperative exchange of faculty opportunities or student exchanges and things of that nature? I'm just curious as to what you're thinking in that way, and then how that dovetails into the work that you're doing. So thanks.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited about these opportunities. When I was working on this, I lived in Haiti for a half a year, a couple of years ago, prior to COVID. And I was an assistant director to a very large USAID program there. And one of the projects we were working on was working with the University of Limonade, which is on the north coast of Haiti. And they, it's a really a good university, but there was a $160 million water program going underway with the Inter-American Development Bank. And we were working with the university to develop a water quality lab. And the idea was, I mean, we could have gone to local business, we could have gone to an outside entity, even a US entity. But our idea was, how can you create a teaching opportunity through that local university? And those were, one of these first steps kind of thing of when you can start getting, start working with a university in baby steps, so to speak, then you can start helping more and more and developing more and more of a sharing program. Because education in Haiti is not very good. And it's a very rote, it's education kind of based on rote memorization quite often. The other thing about education in Haiti, though, is if you look at a per capita money spent or a percentage of their income spent on educating their kids, it is way above what Western nations would normally spend on education. Haiti really values education. Unfortunately, it doesn't have very good education. And so, building local capacity, it doesn't just involve supply chains for well parts. I mean, it also is building the professionals in country who can solve their own problems, so to speak, in the country. In terms of very much specifics, I think there are sharing programs. These what we do in more developed countries like Spain or something like that. I think we could start developing that in Haiti. Of some, you could have a semester course or whatever, and start developing that. But let's not just talk about Haiti either. Right now, I wouldn't send any students down to Haiti because it's way too dangerous. The kidnappings and everything is just way out of hand. I can't even drive from city to city anymore. I used to do that all the time, all by myself. And and now I have to fly from city to city. That will turn around eventually. A year or two from now, they'll get on top of that problem, and we'll be back to probably more an easier country to work in. But there could be Honduras, it could be Ecuador, it could be all kinds of opportunities. And honestly, I know you weren't asking this, I don't think, but I would love to start working also with University of Michigan, Western Michigan University, and because there's opportunities for research and grants and so forth that we could bring in visiting scholars to do that kind of work.
We have a few students in the audience that I know are actually interested in working in hydrogeologic stuff. And is there a project underway through the CWI for the upcoming summer that they might want to know about?
I am trying to develop that now. We've got a number of projects underway. The engineering department is doing an Ecuador trip, and they're doing research on a number of things. One is water quality treatment, primarily chlorination, as well as they're looking at how to make a better spring cap. A spring cap is essentially taking a concrete box, and putting that around the spring so that you isolate the water coming out from the surface, and you theoretically keep it cleaner. And there's still a lot of problems with it, though. And so the engineering department is doing work on that right now to try to develop kind of almost like a French drain system that captures the water before it reaches the surface, and then stores it and releases it. So that work is happening in Ecuador. We also have this work in Jordan, which is really super interesting work. It's reanimating old Roman waterworks from nearly 2,000 years ago, and making those old Roman works functional now for modern water retention. This is an area in Jordan that is very water poor. They're mining their groundwater terribly. way beyond the sustainable pump yields of those wells. So the wells are dropping essentially, and you know, reanimating the Roman works is essentially capturing surface waters and then treating that. We don't have a program developed yet for that. That work has been going on through the Institute for years now, paid for in part by Rotary funds. But and Bert DeVries from the archaeology department is leading that. But there's certainly work to be done, and there's next phases to be done. There's also cloud forest work down in Ecuador. That was some things that the NGO down there said would be very helpful for them. So I know Tom Timmermans has ideas about some stuff that he would like to do through his NGO, Coldwater. So there's stuff, but first of all, we're a little bit repressed from the COVID stuff. But then the other problem is that we still haven't fully developed these ideas yet and found funding for them.
Stuart, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what advice you would give students who want to end up being where you are right now. So obviously, I think you're in a position because of your expertise and the things that you've done to be working on some of these projects. And a student coming right out of Calvin is not going to be able to jump right into your shoes, for example. What advice would you have for students in terms of, if this is their long-term goal, how would they move towards this goal?
Yeah. A couple of things. I mean, one was the language. Is definitely concentrate on your language. It is my Achilles heel. I mean, I'm severely limited because of my language or lack thereof. I mean, I can write in French and I can read French, but I can't speak it. And effectively, it's very hard to work with people if you don't speak their language. So that's one. A second thing is really understand what you're getting into. It's really very cool work and very interesting work, but it also has some real issues to it too. I mean, the pay is terrible usually. And the other thing is, you know, you really have to put up with quite a few discomforts and so forth. International travel is fascinating, and if you kind of got a pioneer spirit, you can deal with it. But also you have to know that you know, it's a hard row physically quite often. One of the advices though I would have is that I think a lot of students kind of derail themselves too quickly on kind of the programmatic stuff. Now, you've got to be, I think you've got to be instructed, and you've got to be very conscious of all of these things I ended my talk with. These, you know, respect for the individual and local supply chains and all that kind of stuff. You've got to have that in your mind. But I think you know, a science student, a hydrogeologic student needs to really get good at what they do. And, you know, get really good at GIS, for instance. That's another Achilles heel of mine. I mean, luckily I have good team members and that are all smarter than me in many ways. And so, you know, get very good at the tools that you use. Get very good at even working domestically and working on you know, water projects domestically. So you hone your skills. In my opinion, it's a very rare thing that there are really good scientists out there. There's very good engineers, and there's very good program managers in the development world. But the scientists tend to get derailed too quickly, and they start getting into, you know, running a program where it's 99% management and 1% science. And I would say, you know, actually turn down an opportunity that might get you there too quickly.
Thank you.
How many of these people on the phone were part of the hydro class earlier this week?
I think that will be a question for Melinda if she can look at.
I'm just curious because I didn't want to try to repeat myself too much. So I actually really I spent a lot more time on the science in Melinda's class than I did today. So.
I've unmuted now. So we have at least we have one that I can see right now that is
Okay.
from the hydro class. And there will definitely be some watching the recording. There were several conflicts with sports practice and whatnot this afternoon.
I saw some names of people and they had to leave already. Yeah.
Yeah, so you didn't
Good.
you didn't overlap anything for anybody too badly at all. And it was
Good.
actually, it was awesome for us to hear the rest of the story. So we got the best end of the deal.
Good.
Well, I'm going to do two things. I have another question that I'd like to ask, but I think I'm also going to just formally thank you and call the formal part of this seminar to an end, and then invite people to stay behind in kind of the informal asking a few more questions at that point in time, if you're willing to stay for that. So we just really appreciate you talking with us and bringing your knowledge and all of your experience to us in the seminar series. And again, people who are on video, maybe you can show a wild round of applause. So you can see some of that applause there. And even if you can't see it, it's happening behind some of these names as well. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you for letting me come in. You know, I don't mind always pitching the Institute. So that's my new job, you know. So,
well, and it's got a lot of good stuff for you to be pitching about that Institute. So a question that I have as we go into the informal question period here would be, you've emphasized the importance of involving the local community in the work. And I saw that the pictures looked like there were a variety of people from the local community and maybe people coming in from the outside. How does that practically work? How were you able to engage people from the local community? Was this by hiring people on to help with the work? Were they eager to have these projects come in?
Yeah, you know, I mean, there's multiple ways in which it's done. And I mean, one of the ways is that a lot of times the customer we work with, which is an NGO or someone, they'll have the local involvement there will be water committees that they've developed in order to invite the service to come in and help them, or, you know, kind of the organizational and the societal involvement, which is very important from an ownership standpoint and so forth. But when we are then doing the work, the investigation work, we always try to hire locally. And quite often we'll have 20 workers working for us, carrying equipment. The other thing that has to happen is it's, you know, when you do this kind of thing, you think you're coming in to help, but you're not always well liked. You know, I mean, so the local people help pave the way for the work. You become trusted by the local community when you have local staff that can represent yourself to them. I mean, we've gotten stoned before. We've gotten, you know, our equipment sabotaged, stolen from, all kinds of things. And the local people will help us essentially welcomed by the community. One time we were walking up to a spring, and a whole bunch of people came at us with machetes because they thought they had some sort of conspiracy theory that we were putting cholera in the wells. and in the springs. That was during the height of the cholera and everything. There was all of this swirl of misinformation like we see even here in the US. You know, again, that time we didn't do a very good job of creating, you know, or having, you know, our local emissaries. The other thing we do is we always go talk to the mayor or the Kazakh or one of the local leaders at least, and tell them why we're here and ask them essentially permission to be there, and do that. So then we also hire people for security. Sometimes we hire them for their muscle, because I'll tell you, carrying a car battery for several 10 kilometers with that's a killer. I mean, that is one heavy piece of square thing with a sharp edge on it, basically, once you carry it for that long. So we'll hire people to be carrying that stuff. And so it's a variety. And in fact, you know, like when I was working in Africa, that's actually kind of my job on the team, is that I run the local group. Even though I have the poor language skills, I can usually communicate pretty well and get the local people to help us. And again, you know what, the key there though is you gotta really put your ego on hold on those things. And you know, you're working with equals, and you've got to really communicate that. You got to be authentic with these people, because then you build that trust. They start thinking that you're there to help them rather than dominate them. You're not new colonials, basically. My answers can sometimes be 20 times longer than the question. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, that's great. It was interesting, and I'm trying to hold myself back from asking 20 more questions that kind of arose as you were doing that.
I love talking about this stuff. I mean, I really do. And so, you know, when COVID, I'm at Calvin maybe once or twice a week now. I usually try to be there on Wednesdays all day, and then hopefully maybe another day. But once COVID maybe suppresses itself a little bit more, I really look forward to having office hours and having open doors and being able to talk to people who, like the students who are looking for, how do I get into this kind of work, you know?
Yes.
Or what can the Ralph's question, what does the Institute have, you know, in its back pocket right now that we're looking to develop into summer work?
You have been very instrumental in training some future geoscientists that have come out of our department that have gone on. And I'm thinking Isaac Jacques, for example.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so you've been wonderful from that standpoint.
Yeah, that was really rewarding working with Isaac. And Tom and I took him down to Honduras, and we worked in those high coffee regions, which is extremely enjoyable work. I mean, working for those farmers up at the high elevations, those small coffee farmers at high elevations. You know, the idea behind water there is that coffee can either be dried or it can be washed in order to get that husk off of the bean. And washed coffee tastes much better and is much better coffee, kind of an Arabica coffee. And when you can provide them water or help them get water, let's put it that way better, so that they can have washed coffee, theoretically, they can sell their coffee for almost double what a dried coffee is. And, you know, when they're earning $1,200 a year, if you could have a really positive impact, like doubling that income, that's a really neat opportunity. And so that's how water plays into that community, plus all their health problems and everything else. Well, Isaac, when he came down, Tom and I were there for what, a week, Tom? or so. And then,
Yeah, we spent a week with them down there. Yeah.
yeah. And then Isaac stayed down there for another 3 weeks, 4 weeks after that, and collected all this geologic information. And now he went to grad school in Ontario, I believe.
Nova Scotia.
Nova Scotia. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. And so anyway, I think we did influence him a little bit. He was able to see it for what it was.
Well, if I jump in here too, just on that regard, and thank you to the department for welcoming Stu in and having him be part of the university, because, I was reminded of, because, Stu and I were there before any of you were, I guess, right? But I remember sitting in Jim Clark's office over at Wheaton, and I tell you, it just blessed my heart to see Jim back involved with the Institute at Calvin again. But I was sitting in Jim's office and with Jason Brink, and we just started thinking about the kind of connections that you all are making right now with these students, like the ones that are in Melinda's class right now. We're saying, hey, I might have an interest in this, and then they get a connect, and it just thrills me. This is exactly what we were thinking about when we started the Institute all those years ago. I mean, it's just so well done, Stu, and thank you to the rest of you in the department for just embracing this and being part of it. And it's exciting to see. So.
Hey, I'd like to add to that too, is that the Institute doesn't have a lot of history working with the geoscience people, because, it's been run by the engineers and so forth, and that's just great, because that's part of the problem. But I would love to see, part of the water problem is what I meant, but I really did mean that. But I would love to see a greater involvement by the geosciences, and because obviously my heart's there, but also there's so much opportunity, and it's such practical good work and everything else. I would just love to see that develop more. Again, I feel a little hampered because of COVID. We can't just sit and brainstorm quite like we used to be able to, but hopefully that will be around the corner again, and brainstorm projects, funding opportunities. We got to bring funds into this institute so we can afford to do this stuff. But there's my experience in the international development arena is that there's much more money out there than there's people doing the work. And so it's just a matter of tapping that resource and then, using it for the benefit of students to learn and to do the research and everything else.
Your point about French language skills is really interesting. And I know I've known people from, say, the Republic of the Congo, and they all speak French, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
a lot of the Central African countries, French is basically literally the lingua franca of the country.
Yep.
And our French department might be very interested to hear that fact. I don't know if you've had a conversation with anyone over there or not.
We have,
Okay.
and just within the last several weeks, really. And Otto introduced us into the department, and I'm actually very, very passionate about that point, and for a couple of reasons. One is to communicate effectively with people. Honestly, the translation thing, you can actually be pretty good at it, but if you're not really great at it, there's a brokenness of between people. So that interpersonal dynamic is so important when you're dealing with people, especially when you're dealing cross-culturally as well. So that's one thing. The other thing about language, though, especially about French, is it's a point of pride. I mean, and we all know this from the jokes about traveling in France, in terms of people not speaking, even if, or Montreal or whatever, also, where people won't speak to you in English, even though they know it. But that is multiplied in a country like Haiti, because honestly, they're proud of their French heritage. They're proud of the French language. And so if it's more than just the ability to communicate. It's also, there's some, well, it's the same annoyance that you have when someone in the business world doesn't speak good English, and you're maybe not annoyed at that person, but you're annoyed about your inability to adequately sometimes communicate, you know. And so there's a friction there that occurs just naturally if you can't communicate well. And that's what they experience when we come into their country, and you know, are like myself, you know, are terrible at it. You know, I need to speak through interpreters basically, because especially with French, bad French is sometimes worse than no French at all, you know.
Yeah, I'll back that up a little bit. Stu, you remember when we were sitting in Orlando's at Orlando's house in Honduras, and what did he say? I mean, he said it with a big smile on his face. He says, "But why doesn't Donald Trump spend some money and have you all learn Spanish?" Yeah. Or something like that. Yeah. And to your point, and Stu, you and I've talked about this, but Jason Brink and I went back to Honduras to follow up and collect some additional data to follow up on the work that you and Isaac had done, and the rest of us a year earlier. And honestly, being with Jason Brink, who is fluent, but also knew the objectives. So you get that translator out of the way.
Yeah.
I think we accomplished as much in 2 days as what we would have in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Just because Jason knew the language, knew the culture, and could, you know, talk with the folks about what they knew, because they know a lot.
Yeah.
But you got that, it's technical, you know, we're looking for technical answers, and that's a hard thing to translate.
Yeah,
So
it
that language barrier is huge.
So one of the things I was thinking of is just for those who don't know, I've been supported by the Clean Water Institute for the last 5 years, working on a project with others at Calvin in stats, math, and sociology and social work and public health. We've all been working together as kind of a collaborative team on clean water in Liberia. We've built a couple of things, but GIS has been a big part of that, and building an online kind of mapping system to look at the transformation of what clean water could do in the country of Liberia. So I'm excited about that work. It's wrapping up this summer, but it did give me, you know, the ideas, just as you were thinking, Stu, of what if the Clean Water Institute to tighten the collaboration with GEO, if they established a cartography and GIS position for a student. This would be somebody who manages the spatial data that comes into the institute, somebody that provides kind of mapping help or even consultation for other projects and stuff like that. So I just wonder, you know, if we might establish a student kind of cartography position that would then deepen kind of our relationship more formally with GEO and what we're doing. You know, the Ecosystem Preserve has done this now, which is really exciting. And for the last, this is the second summer coming up, they'll have somebody dedicated to that all summer, working on their online mapping system for the Eco Preserve and the spatial layers that go with that. So I could just kind of see that training for our students and building that capacity for the Clean Water Institute, making it an outward service to the community that shows them the good work through a mapping interface and so on and so forth as a possible connection.
I love that idea, and I partly because there's a project that I've been conceptualizing for the last probably decade now, but it would be something that could fall out of that kind of establishing that position and that structure in the department. And I'll describe it to you. Is one of the problems, and one of the things I said in my talk, is that quite often we're really pioneering the data collection in a particular area. And what we're doing really through these hydrogeologic assessments is that we're trying to reduce the risk of drilling. Now, we could go out and just wildcat, just drill and see what's there. And if our drilling services and diesel is cheap enough and everything else, we could maybe poke a lot of holes in the ground and forego some of this other investigation at least. But we can't do that. But what you find out is in these countries, and I estimated in Haiti that it's worth at probably north of $100 million of data that's sitting on shelves in NGOs, in drillers' offices, in basically all these unpublished data sumps, essentially. If you could gather that data, georeference it, and curate it somehow through data sciences and through, I mean, it's not an easy task, but if you could grab $100 million worth of data in Haiti, hydrogeologic data, essentially obtained through geophysics surveys, drilling, pipeline studies, all of that kind of stuff. And you could assemble that into a database that was available for the country to use themselves, for people who, like myself, who come into the country and use that and resource that. I think that'd be a tremendous opportunity. I've talked to the World Bank about this. They're extremely interested in it because it's essentially you're spending it, 10 cents on the dollar essentially to get this program together. And really, so far, the barriers have been is you have to define well what the structure is for the data that can be updatable, that can handle accuracy issues and all those data science questions that we have. But, a project like that, I'm not saying that is the program you just described, but it's a project that could fall out of a program like you described and be part of a sustaining program or project that sustains that kind of a position. I love the idea.
Sure. Awesome.
I'm actually, that's my springtime project, is to try to develop that. We have, when I first pitched that to the World Bank, I got the government of Haiti to endorse the idea. And when we pitched it to the World Bank, it didn't only involve Haiti, but that was kind of our starting ground, so to speak. But they were willing to put up $1 million into that project. But again, we didn't have it adequately designed. I mean, I'm a hydrogeologist and I suck at GIS. I can do it, but I suck at it. So, I mean, I really need someone else to be a champion for a project like that in order to take that to the next level.
Well, we can talk.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
And one of the other exciting things about that idea is that it makes involvement in this type of work more accessible to possibly a larger number of students. So they're very much looking for just experiences that they can put on their resume, but also if it's an experience that has a goal where they know they're part of something bigger, that also adds to that experience. But it's expensive to take students to Honduras and to Haiti, and they're not always going to be the most effective in that situation as well. Some of your experienced scientists are going to be more effective in that field situation. But if you can bring the data, you know, to something like Calvin University, and there's a program designed that can keep on moving students into that role where they get this excellent experience, but at the end of it, also Haiti or Honduras or other places get a real wealth of information and tools that can enable them.
Yep.
It sounds amazing.
Oh, the learning opportunities are great. And you're right, though, it needs to be all supervised, and that's why we need real funding. I mean, for something like that. And, you know, Doug always cautions me when I get excited about these programs or projects. I mean, he says, you know, remember, we're here first and foremost as a teaching organization. And I agree with that. But at the same time, you know, if we could get really good funding, so we could have a paid principal investigator and maybe even other investigators that are paid in somehow that doesn't require volunteerism, which is something I kind of actually really hate. I like people to get paid for what they're doing, you know? And so, you know, if we could develop that funding and so forth and get that supervision, just think what we could do to roll in all those students from a learning standpoint and pay them too, help them with their tuition payments, you know?
And as you said, it's effective use of the money. The return for the people who are benefiting from this data is real, and it's an effective investment in that.
Well, you know, that investigation I showed you today, or I showed you several, kind of took pieces from several, but the main one you saw the maps coming out of, you know, we spent $125,000 and we lost money on it, basically. But that's what our revenue from that project was. And so, you know, if you could make those projects either focused on areas where you don't have the data more, or where if you could reduce certain aspects of that project, that's real returns to the development community. Plus, the other thing is, and this is the key, and we didn't do this terribly right with that project I talked about with data, but since then we've learned a few things that we thought we should do better. And one of them is, how do you make that data accessible to the drillers that are working in Haiti now? The in-country Haitian drillers, how do you make that accessible so that they can use it in their business? You know, it will save them a lot of dry holes too, because when you drill a well, you typically, in Haiti at least, you drill a well for success, meaning you don't get paid unless that well yields water. And, you know, a lot of drillers won't even take a well a lot of times if they don't think they'll get water. But if you could give them a reference resource of existing data in the area of their drilling, even if they don't understand hydrogeology that well, it might be able to help them guide and reduce their risk, basically. Yep. See you, Tom.
Great to see you, Tom. Oh, I think I'm going to take off too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I just looked at the time, and this has been a great conversation, but we probably should call it to a close for most of us. Thank you so much, Stuart, again.
Well, I had fun with it, and thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Stuart.
And maybe we'll do a early summer meet outdoors, you know, bring our chairs and
I love that idea.
Talk ideas. You know, that'd be great.
I love that idea. Okay.
All right. Well, I'll wave goodbye to everybody, and everybody can wave, and then I'll actually end the meeting for all. So thank you all.
You bet. Bye.
Thank you.